Imagine this: the South China Sea, calm waters stretching endlessly, suddenly becomes the stage of a dangerous face-off. China, confident and unchallenged, makes a move at Scarborough Shoal that sends shockwaves across the Pacific. But what they didn't expect was America's reaction. A reaction so decisive, so unexpected, that it left the world stunned. This isn't just a story of two nations flexing military muscle. It's about pride, power, and the one shocking twist that changed everything. Stay with me till the end, because the truth behind what happened at Scarborough Shoal will leave you speechless. The Scarborough Shoal, a tiny triangle of rocks and reefs in the South China Sea, has been at the center of one of the most heated territorial disputes in modern times. On maps, it looks insignificant, barely a few square kilometers. But in reality, this shoal holds strategic value far beyond its size. Whoever controls Scarborough controls fishing grounds, sea routes, and potentially trillions of dollars in underwater resources. For years, Filipino fishermen considered these waters their home. That changed when Chinese vessels began encroaching, building artificial presence, and slowly pushing Manila out. At first, the Philippines protested diplomatically. But Beijing wasn't listening. Then came the moment of provocation. China deployed heavily armed Coast Guard and maritime militia ships, blocking Filipino boats and asserting undisputed sovereignty. It was a bold move, but one that wouldn't go unanswered. Because just across the ocean, the United States, bound by its defense pact with the Philippines, was watching. And when Washington finally responded, the ending shocked even China. The U.S. has always declared that it does not take sides in territorial disputes until its allies are threatened. The Scarborough crisis tested this policy to the breaking point. As China tightened its grip, Washington issued warnings, calling Beijing's actions aggressive and destabilizing. But this wasn't just about words. The U.S. Navy began deploying carrier strike groups into the South China Sea, sending a powerful signal. Satellite images showed destroyers and submarines quietly positioning near disputed waters. At first, many assumed it was routine, freedom of navigation patrols. But behind the scenes, the Pentagon had already drawn a red line. Any direct aggression against the Philippines would trigger an American response. What made this even more dangerous was the timing. U.S.-China relations were already strained by trade wars, espionage accusations, and Taiwan tensions. The Scarborough Shoal became the flashpoint that could ignite a much larger conflict. Yet, no one could have predicted the ending. China's move at Scarborough Shoal wasn't just an accident. It was part of a broader playbook the world now calls salami slicing. Instead of launching a massive invasion, Beijing takes small, calculated steps, seizing one reef, blocking one fishing fleet, building one artificial island. Each step seems minor, but together they slowly rewrite the map of the South China Sea. Scarborough was a perfect target, close to the Philippines, rich in resources, yet lightly defended. By sending Coast Guard ships instead of warships, China could claim it was law enforcement, not aggression. This tactic kept things below the threshold of outright war. But it was still a provocation. Filipino fishermen suddenly found themselves harassed, their boats blocked, their livelihoods crushed. For Manila, it was humiliating. For Washington, it was a test. If America ignored Scarborough, allies would doubt its security guarantees. If it reacted too strongly, it risked sparking war with the world's second superpower. The stakes were higher than ever. As Chinese ships entrenched themselves, the Philippines faced a nightmare. Outgunned and outnumbered, Manila had no chance of pushing China out alone. That's when the government officially invoked its Mutual Defense Treaty with the U.S., a pact signed in 1951 promising that any attack on one would be met by both. It was a bold move, forcing Washington's hand. President after president had promised to stand by allies. But this was the moment to prove it. Filipino fishermen gave heartbreaking testimonies of being chased away by water cannons, their nets destroyed, their families starving. International media began broadcasting these images, sparking outrage worldwide. In Washington, policymakers debated, should America risk conflict with China over A few rocks. Or was this the moment to show that U.S. commitments meant something? The decision, when it came, would stun the world. The order was given: the U.S. Pacific Fleet would stage a show of force. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines sailed toward the South China Sea in one of the largest deployments in recent years. For Beijing, this was a shock. They had expected protests, maybe sanctions, not strike groups within sight of their Coast Guard ships. American jets roared across the sky, performing freedom of navigation flights right over disputed waters. The message was crystal clear: the Scarborough Shoal was not China's to take unchallenged. Filipino citizens cheered as U.S. forces arrived, their confidence in the alliance restored. Yet beneath the surface, the risk of escalation grew. One wrong move, a collision at sea, a misinterpreted radar lock, could ignite a war no one wanted. The stage was set for a confrontation that the world held its breath to witness. China was furious. On state media, anchors thundered that America had no right to interfere in China's sovereign territory. Beijing accused Washington of militarizing the South China Sea and warned that its patience was running out. Behind the scenes, the Chinese Navy began mobilizing. Warships shadowed U.S. vessels, submarines slipped quietly beneath the waves, and fighter jets flew menacingly close to American patrols. This wasn't just about Scarborough anymore. It was about power, prestige, and the image of a rising China, unwilling to be bullied. Beijing's leaders calculated that if they backed down now, their global ambitions would suffer a crushing blow. So they decided to double down, holding massive naval drills near the shoal, showcasing their newest destroyers and anti-ship missiles. The message was clear: China would not yield. But what they didn't anticipate was how Washington would flip the script entirely, catching them off guard in a way that stunned the world. As tensions escalated, the entire globe tuned in. News outlets ran live coverage of U.S. carriers and Chinese destroyers circling the same patch of ocean. Analysts warned this could spiral into the most dangerous standoff since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nations across Asia grew anxious. Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia, all with their own disputes against China, quietly hoped America would hold firm. Japan openly supported Washington, while European allies issued statements urging restraint. Even Russia, usually China's partner, called for cool heads. Financial markets trembled at the thought of a conflict between the world's two largest economies. Every hour, international observers asked the same question: would Scarborough be the spark that lit the fuse of World War II? What the public didn't see was the frantic diplomacy happening behind closed doors. U.S. and Chinese officials were locked in secret talks, desperate to prevent disaster. Hotlines between Washington and Beijing buzzed with urgent messages. Both sides knew the risk. A single miscalculation could unleash a chain reaction no one could control. The Philippines, meanwhile, played its part, pleading with both powers to de-escalate while reminding Washington of its treaty obligations. But here's where things got interesting. While the world expected America to rely purely on military pressure, Washington had another card to play. Using backchannels, U.S. diplomats crafted an unexpected offer, one that would completely change the trajectory of the Scarborough crisis. Instead of demanding that China retreat immediately, Washington proposed something radical. The U.S. offered to mediate a shared access arrangement. Filipino fishermen would regain their rights, Chinese ships would reduce their blockade, and both sides would refrain from building new structures on the shoal. On paper, it was a compromise. But behind the scenes, it was a masterstroke. America knew that China desperately wanted to avoid looking weak at home. By offering a deal where Beijing could save face, Washington gave them an exit without calling it a defeat. At the same time, U.S. forces remained firmly in position, ensuring that if China refused, it would face overwhelming pressure. The gamble was risky, but it worked. Slowly, Beijing began to soften its rhetoric. Even as state media tried to spin the story in China's favor, the world braced for the final outcome, and what happened next shocked everyone. When Washington's offer was placed on the table, China hesitated. Inside the halls of Zhongnanhai, senior officials debated furiously. Hardliners wanted to reject the deal outright. They argued that Scarborough was Chinese territory and compromise meant weakness. Moderates, however, pointed out that the U.S. Navy's overwhelming presence posed a real danger. If a clash occurred, China might lose ships, prestige, and billions in trade within days. So, Beijing played for time. Their coast guard remained at the shoal, but they scaled back aggressive tactics. No water cannons, no blockades, just silent patrols. It was a pause, carefully calculated. The world read it as a sign China was thinking. But was it reconsidering or planning a new move? For the Philippines, the shift was dramatic. Fishermen who had once been chased away cautiously returned to the shoal. Some reported that Chinese vessels still loomed nearby, but they no longer blocked access. Manila seized the opportunity, declaring the joint U.S.-Philippine alliance stronger than ever. Crowds in the capital celebrated the sight of American carriers protecting their sovereignty. Politicians who had doubted Washington's commitment now praised its resolve. For ordinary Filipinos, it wasn't just about fish. It was about dignity. For the first time in years, they felt they had stood up to a giant and survived. Yet, behind the celebrations, leaders worried would this fragile calm last, or was China preparing to strike back harder than before? Back in China, state media told a very different story. News anchors boasted that Chinese patrols remained in control of Scarborough, emphasizing that no foreign power could change that. They downplayed U.S. naval deployments, calling them routine exercises. To the Chinese public, the narrative was clear. Beijing had defended its sovereignty without bending. But inside government circles, leaders quietly accepted that the U.S. had forced a pause. It was a delicate balancing act. Show strength at home, but avoid escalation abroad. What no one knew was that China was already working on a longer-term plan. Scarborough may have paused, but Beijing's ambition to dominate the South China Sea was far from over. Just when it seemed the crisis was cooling, the twist came. Satellite imagery revealed something shocking: Chinese dredging ships moving toward the shoal. Intelligence reports suggested Beijing was preparing to build artificial islands, just as it had done in the Spratlys and Parasols. If true, this would completely change the balance of power. A fortified Scarborough would allow China to project military power deep into the Philippine coastline. U.S. officials were stunned. Had Beijing really agreed to calm down, only to use the pause as cover for something bigger? The revelation reignited debates in Washington. Should America strike first to prevent construction? Or would that drag the region into a full-scale war? The stakes had never been higher. The Pentagon didn't waste time. Within hours of the satellite leaks, U.S. destroyers and surveillance aircraft were on high alert. Washington issued a blunt warning: any attempt to build permanent structures on Scarborough Shoal would be considered a direct threat to regional stability. Behind closed doors, generals even drafted contingency plans for airstrikes on dredging vessels if construction began. For the first time, America openly tied its credibility to a patch of rocks in the South China Sea. The world gasped. Was the U.S. really willing to risk war over Scarborough? Beijing, too, was stunned. The gamble it had hoped would slip under the radar had now turned into a global red line. The question was simple, but terrifying: who would blink first? Scarborough Shoal became the most dangerous patch of ocean on Earth. Chinese dredging ships hovered at the edges, shadowed by Coast Guard vessels. American destroyers prowled nearby, their radars locked on targets, while Philippine patrol boats circled nervously. One spark, a miscalculation, a misfire, could ignite the biggest military clash of the 21st century. In Washington, war planners ran simulations. If China built on the shoal, it would gain a permanent military outpost less than 150 miles from Manila. That was unacceptable. In Beijing, commanders argued that backing down would embolden the U.S. and weaken China's claim over the South China Sea. The standoff was no longer about rocks or reefs. It was about who would define the rules of the future: America or China. The world now realized this wasn't just a U.S.-China conflict. Japan pledged naval support. Australia quietly sent surveillance aircraft. Even Britain announced it would join freedom of navigation patrols. For the first time, an international coalition was forming to challenge Beijing's maritime expansion. The Philippines, once unsure of Washington's commitment, suddenly found itself at the center of global attention. Filipino fishermen, once powerless, became symbols of resistance. Their small wooden boats contrasted against the towering silhouettes of warships. The message to China was unmistakable. This was no longer a regional dispute. If Beijing pushed further, it would face not just America, but the world. Then, almost as suddenly as it began, the crisis shifted. Chinese dredging ships disappeared from satellite imagery. Coast Guard patrols thinned. State media quietly stopped mentioning Scarborough. Analysts were stunned. Had Beijing really blinked? Insiders later revealed that China's leadership had calculated the risks and decided it wasn't the right time. With its economy slowing and tensions with Taiwan already brewing, opening a second front against the U.S. was too dangerous. So, Beijing chose to retreat. But in silence, never admitting defeat. To the outside world, it looked like America's warning had worked. To China's citizens, it was framed as a strategic pause. But to historians, it was clear Scarborough had been a test, and Beijing had been forced to back down. For the Philippines, the outcome was nothing short of historic. Filipino fishermen returned to the shoal with renewed freedom. Manila declared victory, pointing to the U.S.-Philippine alliance as the shield that had protected national sovereignty. Public celebrations erupted as footage of American carriers patrolling the waters spread across local television. Politically, it was a turning point. Leaders who once considered drifting closer to China now openly embraced Washington. The message was clear: alliances mattered, and standing firm against aggression could deliver results. Yet, even in celebration, there was unease. Everyone knew China would not forget. Scarborough was quiet, but for how long? The Scarborough Shoal standoff became a textbook case of 21st century power politics. It revealed how small islands and reefs could hold enormous strategic importance. It showed the world that America's security commitments still carried weight. That U.S. alliances in Asia were not just symbolic. It exposed China's strategy of salami slicing and demonstrated how carefully calibrated resistance could halt it. Most importantly, it reminded nations everywhere that modern conflicts don't always start with bombs. They begin with fishing boats, patrol ships, and strategic patience. Scarborough proved that even a tiny shoal could tilt the balance of global power. And here's the shocking truth: the crisis at Scarborough didn't end with war, but with something even more powerful: perception. China had provoked, America had responded, and the Philippines had regained dignity. Yet the real victory was psychological. Washington had shown the world it would not abandon allies, and Beijing had been reminded that its rise would not go unchallenged. The ending shocked everyone because, in a world bracing for war, peace, however fragile, prevailed. But make no mistake, Scarborough was not the last battle. It was the opening act of a much larger struggle for the South China Sea, a struggle whose next chapter is still being written. The world may have been shocked once, but the real shock may yet come.